The email arrived at 8:12 a.m., while Natalie Cross was still halfway through her first cup of coffee. Subject line: Immediate meeting with HR. No explanation. No context. Just a calendar invite scheduled for 8:30 a.m., marked mandatory. Inside Argent Shield, mandatory meetings with HR rarely meant anything good. But Natalie Cross wasn't worried. Not really. For 6 years, she had been the quiet backbone of Argent Shield's cybersecurity team. She was the analyst who noticed anomalies no one else saw. The one who stayed late, tracing intrusion attempts across foreign networks. The one who caught the breach from a Russian botnet 2 years earlier. The breach that would have destroyed the company. Officially, the CTO took credit for that. Unofficially, everyone on the security team knew the truth. Still, Natalie Cross had never cared much about recognition. She cared about systems, patterns, and the silent war happening behind every corporate firewall. At 8:21 a.m., she finished reviewing a suspicious login attempt from an IP address in Bucharest. She tagged it, logged the behavior, and pushed a note to the internal security dashboard. Then she closed her laptop. At 8:28 a.m., Natalie Cross walked down the glass hallway toward conference room 4. HR meetings always happen there. Neutral room, gray chairs, white walls, no windows. Inside the room sat 3 people. Laura from HR, CTO Daniel Kessler, and the company's outside legal advisor. That was the first moment Natalie Cross felt something shift. Because legal never attended routine HR meetings. Laura folded her hands carefully. "Natalie," she said, her voice rehearsed, "we've discovered evidence that a recent security breach may have originated from your workstation." The sentence landed like cold steel. For a moment, Natalie Cross didn't respond. Not because she was shocked, because she immediately knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Her workstation was the most monitored machine in the building. Every log, every connection, every packet, tracked, verified, archived. Blaming her for a breach was like blaming a bank vault for a robbery. Daniel Kessler slid a printed report across the table. "We have internal records suggesting your credentials were used during the incident." Credentials, not workstation. Interesting. Natalie Cross didn't touch the paper. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel. "Do you want to explain," she asked calmly, "why those logs don't exist in the primary security archive?" The room went silent. For exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, everyone in that room realized something. They had expected panic, denial, maybe anger. What they hadn't expected was Natalie Cross noticing the flaw in their story immediately. Daniel leaned back slowly. "We're not here to debate the investigation." Laura cleared her throat. "Your access will be revoked effective immediately. Termination. Just like that." 6 years erased in under 10 minutes. But what none of them understood was that Natalie Cross had spent 6 years building the very system they were now pretending to understand. And systems always remembered the truth. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence inside conference room 4 felt strangely artificial, like a performance everyone had rehearsed, except Natalie Cross. Laura from HR slid a document across the table. "Termination notice. Standard language. Corporate tone. Cold. Efficient. Your system access will be disabled at 8:35 a.m., Laura said carefully. "And security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." Daniel Kessler didn't look at her. He was watching Natalie Cross instead. Waiting for something. Anger. Panic. Desperation. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Understood." No argument. No raised voice. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything. Because people who knew they were guilty usually fought back. But Natalie Cross looked curious. She stood up calmly. "May I return to my desk?" Laura hesitated, then nodded. At 8:34 a.m., Natalie Cross walked back into the open office floor where she had worked for 6 years. Rows of monitors. Soft keyboard clicks. The low hum of servers behind reinforced glass. The security team's area sat in the far corner, surrounded by large screens displaying network activity. No one looked up. Not yet. They hadn't heard the news. At 8:35 a.m., her screen suddenly locked. Access revoked. Right on schedule. Efficient. Predictable. Exactly the way Argent Shield liked things. Two members of building security appeared beside her desk. Polite. Professional. Uncomfortable. We'll need you to gather your personal items, one of them said. Natalie Cross nodded. There wasn't much to collect. A notebook. A coffee mug. A small framed photo of her younger brother. While she packed the items slowly into her bag, she noticed something strange on one of the large wall displays. A network status panel. Flashing amber. Most people in the office wouldn't have noticed. But Natalie Cross had designed that dashboard. Amber meant something very specific. A conditional security loop had just activated. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That shouldn't be happening. Not today. Not without a configuration change. Which meant only one thing. Someone in executive leadership had already begun modifying the security architecture. Probably Daniel. Trying to reinforce the narrative of the breach. Trying to create evidence after the fact. A risky move. A very risky move. Because the system they were modifying was never meant to be adjusted by people who didn't understand its deeper layers. At 8:41 a.m., Natalie Cross stood up from her desk with her bag. The security officers waited beside her. Across the office floor, the large monitoring display flickered again. Amber turned briefly red, then returned to amber. No one else noticed. But Natalie Cross did. She understood exactly what that meant. Someone had just triggered the first stage of the system's automated containment protocol, and they had absolutely no idea. She walked quietly toward the elevators. At 8:43 a.m., one of the security guards swiped his badge and pressed the lobby button. The elevator doors closed. The office disappeared behind steel walls. Inside the silence of the elevator, Natalie Cross spoke for the first time since leaving the conference room. "You might want to tell Daniel something," she said calmly. The guards looked at her. "What's that?" She adjusted the strap of her bag. "If he keeps changing the security permissions the way he just did." She paused, then gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "The entire network will begin shutting itself down in phases." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Natalie Cross stepped outside into the cold Chicago morning. Behind her, 30 floors above ground, Argent Shield's network monitoring panel quietly turned red again. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor of Argent Shield was built to impress. Floor-to-ceiling glass, dark walnut table, a wall-sized screen prepared for the day's most important presentation. Investors had flown in from New York. 2 representatives from a federal procurement committee were also present. If everything went well today, Argent Shield would secure a government cybersecurity contract worth nearly $400 million. Daniel Kessler stood at the front of the room, perfectly composed, confident, polished. The kind of executive who spoke in calm corporate certainty. "Our security infrastructure," Daniel said, gesturing toward the screen, "has been stress-tested under the most aggressive attack simulations available." Slides moved behind him. Graphs. Threat matrices. System diagrams. None of the investors knew that most of those systems had originally been designed by Natalie Cross. At 9:02 a.m., one of the large network status monitors, mounted near the sidewall, flickered. Red. Just for half a second. Then amber. One of the investors noticed. "What was that?" Daniel glanced over his shoulder. The color had already returned to normal. "Routine background diagnostics," he said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about." The presentation continued. At 9:07 a.m., 3 analysts inside Argent Shield's Network Operations Center began exchanging confused looks. One of the internal servers had just entered containment mode. Automatically. No manual command triggered it. Another analyst leaned closer to his monitor. "That's weird," he muttered. Containment protocols were rarely activated. And when they were, it required authorization from the head of threat intelligence, which, until 30 minutes ago, had been Natalie Cross. At 9:10 a.m., Daniel advanced to the most important slide in the entire presentation. System resilience architecture. "Our network is designed with multiple defensive redundancies," he explained confidently. "If one node were compromised, the rest of the system would continue functioning normally." Behind the glass wall of the conference room, several engineers in the operations center suddenly stood up from their desks. A second server had just entered containment. Then a third. No one had initiated the command. At 9:12 a.m., an engineer quietly left the operations center and hurried toward the executive conference room. Inside the presentation, Daniel was describing the company's automated defense framework. Our system, he said proudly, is capable of identifying and isolating threats faster than any competing platform on the market. The engineer opened the door. Daniel, he said quietly. The interruption irritated him immediately. Not now. The engineer lowered his voice. Sir, multiple servers are entering containment mode. Daniel frowned. That's impossible. The engineer hesitated. 3 so far. Daniel waved a dismissive hand. Probably a monitoring glitch. The investors exchanged uncertain glances. At 9:16 a.m., the network monitoring panel inside the operations center turned red again. This time it didn't switch back. A fourth server locked itself down. Then a fifth. One by one, the system began isolating critical components of Argent Shield's infrastructure, exactly the way the automated containment protocol had been designed to do. Inside the conference room, Daniel forced a confident smile. As I was saying, he continued, our security framework ensures uninterrupted service, even under extreme conditions. Behind him, the giant wall screen suddenly froze. The presentation slides disappeared. The company network had just lost access to the internal server cluster hosting the presentation files. For the first time, Daniel hesitated. A quiet murmur spread across the table. One of the government representatives leaned forward. Is this part of the demonstration? Daniel turned toward the engineer, standing at the door. The engineer's face had gone pale. No, sir. Another phone inside the operations center started ringing. Then another. At 9:18 a.m., the containment protocol entered its second phase. Several authentication services shut down automatically. Employee login access across 3 floors suddenly failed. Inside the conference room, Daniel's laptop screen flashed an error message. Network authentication failed. The room fell silent. And somewhere in the back of Daniel's mind, a realization began forming. A very uncomfortable realization. There was only one person inside Argent Shield who fully understood the architecture of the containment protocol, and that person had walked out of the building less than 40 minutes ago. Natalie Cross. Inside Argent Shield's operations center, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as mild confusion was now turning into controlled panic. 3 engineers were standing around the central monitoring station. 2 others were rapidly typing commands into their consoles. None of them were getting the response they expected. At 9:22 a.m., another core server entered containment mode. One of the engineers leaned closer to his screen. That's number 7, he said quietly. 7 critical nodes isolated. That was no longer a minor system irregularity. That was a cascading containment event. And cascading events were not supposed to happen without a direct override command. Daniel Kessler walked into the operations center with forced composure. What's happening? The lead engineer hesitated. We're still trying to determine that. Daniel looked at the monitoring wall. Rows of network clusters. Most still green. But several were glowing red. How many systems are affected? 7 nodes so far. Daniel frowned. Take them out of containment. The engineer shook his head. We tried. Daniel's voice hardened. Then override the protocol. The engineer swallowed. We can't. Daniel stared at him. What do you mean you can't? The engineer slowly turned his monitor toward him. On the screen was a simple system message. Containment protocol locked. Architect authorization required. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Who has architect authorization? The engineer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew. There had only ever been one architect of Argent Shield's containment system. Natalie Cross. At 9:25 a.m., another alarm appeared on the monitoring wall. An authentication gateway had just shut itself down. Employee access to several internal platforms vanished instantly. Phones inside the operations center started ringing. Managers from other departments were demanding explanations. What's going on? Why can't anyone log in? Why is the network unstable? Daniel rubbed his temples. This is ridiculous. He pulled out his phone. Call Natalie. The engineer blinked. Sir, she was terminated this morning. I'm aware of that, Daniel snapped. Call her anyway. At 9:27 a.m., one of the analysts located her contact information in the internal directory archive. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then the call connected. Natalie speaking. Her voice sounded calm, almost relaxed. Daniel grabbed the phone. This is Daniel. I assumed it might be, Natalie Cross replied. The operations center fell silent. Everyone was listening. Our system is experiencing containment failures, Daniel said. We need you to explain what's happening. There was a short pause on the line. Then Natalie Cross asked a question. A containment failure? Her tone sounded genuinely curious. That's interesting. Daniel clenched his jaw. This isn't the time for games. Of course not, she said calmly. But containment protocols don't activate randomly. At 9:30 a.m., another red alert appeared across the monitoring wall. Node 9 had entered isolation. Daniel glanced up at the screen. Then back to the phone. Something is shutting down our infrastructure. Yes, Natalie Cross said softly. That would be the containment system. Daniel's patience snapped. Then disable it. A quiet breath on the other end of the line. I can't do that. Why not? Because, she said calmly. I no longer work there. Daniel's voice dropped. Then tell us how. There was a longer pause this time. And when Natalie Cross spoke again, her voice carried a subtle edge of something Daniel hadn't heard before. Control. You're asking me to help restore access to a network that your legal team claims I compromised. Daniel said nothing. The room felt suddenly smaller. You accused me of causing a breach, she continued. You revoked my access. You escorted me out of the building. At 9:33 a.m., another cluster on the monitoring wall turned red. The containment protocol had entered its third defensive layer. Half the operations center stood frozen, waiting, listening. On the phone, Natalie Cross spoke again. Tell me something, Daniel. Her tone was quiet, almost conversational. Did you really think the person who built the security system wouldn't notice when you tried to rewrite the logs? Daniel's face drained of color. Inside Argent Shield's operations center, no one moved. Everyone was staring at Daniel, waiting. The monitoring wall behind him continued flashing red warnings. Another node had just entered containment. At 9:36 a.m., the system isolated the internal data routing cluster. Several departments instantly lost access to shared drives. Phones across the building started ringing again, but no one in the operations center answered them. All attention remained on the phone in Daniel's hand. On the other end of the call, Natalie Cross waited patiently. Daniel, she said calmly. Let me ask you a simple question. Daniel forced his voice to remain steady. What? When did you start rewriting the security logs? The room went completely silent. Daniel glanced quickly around the operations center. Several engineers were watching him now. The lead engineer stepped closer. Rewriting logs? Daniel ignored him. That accusation is ridiculous, he said, into the phone. A soft chuckle came through the speaker. You know what I find interesting? Natalie Cross said. At 7:52 a.m., someone accessed the security archive with administrative override privileges. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. The engineer beside him slowly turned toward his console. He was already pulling up the archive records. Natalie continued. At 7:54 a.m., those same credentials attempted to inject modified authentication records. Daniel's heartbeat began to rise. The engineer's eyes widened. He had just found the entry. Sir, the engineer whispered. Daniel didn't look at him. Natalie's voice remained steady. You were trying to create evidence of a breach that never happened. At 9:38 a.m., the conference room door opened again. 2 of the investors had quietly walked down to the operations center. They had heard enough to know something was very wrong. Daniel lowered his voice. You're making dangerous claims. Am I? Natalie Cross replied. The monitoring wall flashed again. Another core node turned red. At 9:39 a.m., the containment protocol moved into its next phase. External network connections began shutting down. Argent Shield's client access portals started failing across the country. Inside the operations center, one of the analysts spoke nervously. We're losing external routing. The investors exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel's confidence was now visibly cracking. Natalie, he said sharply, if you know how to stop this, you need to tell us now. Another pause. Then Natalie Cross spoke slowly. I never said the system was malfunctioning. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. What does that mean? It means, she said calmly, the containment protocol is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The engineer near Daniel leaned forward. That protocol only activates if the system detects a verified intrusion pattern. Daniel froze. Natalie, he said carefully. Are you saying there's an actual breach? Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. The word hung in the air like a dropped blade. At 9:41 a.m., the monitoring wall updated again. Several new alerts appeared simultaneously. Unauthorized access attempts, multiple global locations, encrypted traffic spikes. The lead engineer stared at the data. Oh my God, Daniel's voice turned tight. What? The engineer turned his screen toward him. These are real intrusion signatures. The investors moved closer. What kind of intrusion? One of them asked. The engineer swallowed. Nation-state level. Daniel felt his throat go dry. On the phone, Natalie Cross spoke quietly. You wanted a breach to blame on me. A small pause. Unfortunately for you, another red alert appeared across the wall. Now you actually have one. Inside Argent Shield's operations center, the tension had turned suffocating. Rows of engineers were now standing instead of sitting. No one was pretending this was a minor technical issue anymore. At 9:44 a.m., another alert appeared across the monitoring wall. Multiple authentication servers were now offline. Employee access across nearly half the building had collapsed. Someone whispered quietly, "We're losing internal control layers." Daniel stared at the wall of red indicators. Every instinct in his executive brain told him the situation was spiraling out of control. But the real problem was something else entirely. He had no idea how to stop it. And everyone in the room knew it. The lead engineer spoke carefully. If the containment protocol keeps escalating, the system will eventually isolate the entire infrastructure. Daniel turned sharply. That would shut down the company. The engineer didn't answer, because that was exactly what it meant. The investors were now standing near the back of the room. One of them spoke with blunt impatience. Can you control your own network or not? Daniel forced himself to focus. He lifted the phone again. Natalie. Her voice returned calmly. Yes. We need to stop this escalation. Another quiet pause. Do you? Natalie Cross asked. Daniel's patience snapped. This is not the time for sarcasm. It isn't sarcasm, she replied. It's architecture. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Then explain the architecture. At 9:47 a.m., another security cluster shut itself down. The containment protocol was continuing exactly as designed. Natalie spoke slowly. When I built Argent Shield's containment system, I assumed one day someone inside the company might try to manipulate the logs. Several engineers exchanged looks. Natalie continued. So I designed a verification layer. Daniel felt a cold realization creeping closer. What kind of verification layer? The kind that cross-checks every modified log against the original traffic signatures. One of the engineers whispered. That's why the system locked. Natalie continued. When you tried to inject false breach records this morning, her tone remained calm. The system detected the discrepancy. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. And now it thinks we're under attack. No, Natalie Cross said. Now it knows you tampered with the system. At 9:49 a.m., another alarm echoed through the operations center. External firewalls began shifting into defensive mode. The engineer closest to the monitoring wall spoke urgently. The intrusion signatures are multiplying. Daniel's eyes snapped open. What? The engineer pointed at the screen. Whoever is attacking us just increased traffic volume. The investors looked horrified. How bad is it? One of them asked. The engineer didn't hesitate. If containment fails, he swallowed, they could access parts of our infrastructure. Daniel turned back to the phone. Natalie. Her answer came quietly. Yes, Daniel. You built the system. That's correct. You understand it. Yes. Daniel forced the words out. Then you need to help us stop this. For a few seconds, Natalie Cross said nothing. Outside Argent Shield's glass tower, the Chicago morning continued, as if nothing unusual was happening. Inside the building, an entire company was beginning to realize something terrifying. The person they had just fired was the only one who could save them. Finally, Natalie spoke. "You terminated my employment." Daniel said nothing. "You revoked my system access." Silence again. "You accused me of committing a breach." At 9:52 a.m., the containment system entered its fourth defensive layer. Another series of servers shut down. Several engineers looked ready to panic. Natalie's voice returned to the line. "You fired the architect of the system." A quiet pause. Then she delivered the sentence that froze the entire operations center. "And now you're asking the architect to fix it." Inside Argent Shield's operations center, the room had gone completely still. Every engineer, every manager, every investor, all of them were staring at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to admit what everyone now understood. He had fired the only person capable of fixing the disaster unfolding across their network. At 9:55 a.m., another warning appeared across the monitoring wall. External traffic spikes were climbing. The containment system responded instantly. 3 more servers entered isolation. The lead engineer spoke quietly. "If the attack continues at this rate," he hesitated, "the containment protocol will eventually isolate the entire infrastructure." One of the investors spoke sharply. "How long?" The engineer looked at the system timer. 40 minutes. Maybe less. The room went silent again. Daniel lifted the phone slowly. "Natalie." Her voice came through the speaker with the same calm tone as before. "Yes, Daniel." He forced the next words out. "We need you to come back." Across the operations center, several engineers exchanged looks. Daniel Kessler had never asked anyone for help in his entire career. But now he had no choice. "You're the only one who understands this system," he continued. "If the containment protocol reaches final isolation, we'll lose everything." A quiet pause came through the line. Then Natalie Cross spoke. "That's correct." The investors shifted uncomfortably. One of them stepped closer. "Put the phone on speaker," he said. Daniel hesitated. Then he pressed the button. Natalie's voice now filled the room. "At 9:57 a.m., the containment protocol has already entered Stage 4, she said calmly. "If the attack continues, Stage 5 will begin within 30 minutes. Daniel swallowed. "And what happens at Stage 5? "The system isolates every external gateway." The engineer beside him whispered. "That would cut off every client." Natalie continued. "At Stage 6, the network wipes temporary authentication tokens and rebuilds secure routing." The lead engineer stared at the screen. "That would shut us down for hours." "Possibly longer," Natalie Cross said. The investors looked furious now. One of them turned toward Daniel. "You fired this woman?" Daniel ignored him. "Natalie," he said carefully, "what would it take for you to return and stop the containment escalation?" For a moment, no one spoke. At 9:59 a.m., another alert appeared on the monitoring wall. The attack traffic had doubled again. The containment protocol reacted instantly. 2 more server clusters turned red. Then Natalie spoke. "My conditions are simple." The room leaned closer. "First," she said calmly, "the company issues a written statement confirming that the accusation against me was false." Daniel said nothing. "Second," she continued, "my termination is reversed immediately." One of the investors nodded slowly. That seemed reasonable. Then Natalie spoke again. "Third." The room waited. "Daniel Kessler resigns as Chief Technology Officer." The words landed like a hammer. Daniel's head snapped up. "That's absurd." Natalie's voice remained perfectly calm. "You attempted to fabricate security logs and blame the breach on me." Silence. "You compromised the integrity of the system." Another pause. "And you did it in the middle of an actual cyber attack." The investors were staring at Daniel now. Hard. Cold. Natalie finished quietly. "The company needs someone who understands security architecture." At 10:01 a.m., another alarm echoed through the operations center. The containment protocol had begun preparing the next phase. Natalie's voice returned to the speaker. "You have about 20 minutes to decide." Then the line went quiet. Inside Argent Shield's operations center, the silence after the call felt heavier than the alarms echoing through the room. Every screen still glowed red. Containment warnings continued to pulse across the monitoring wall. But no one was looking at the screens anymore. All eyes were on Daniel. At 10:03 a.m., another system alert appeared. Containment Stage 5 had begun preparing its protocols. The lead engineer spoke quietly. "We have maybe 20 minutes." One of the investors turned slowly toward Daniel. "Is what she said true?" Daniel didn't answer. The investor's voice hardened. "Did you fabricate security logs?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time for internal accusations." Another investor leaned forward. "That's not an answer." Across the operations center, several engineers were still staring at the monitoring wall. Another cluster had just entered containment. At 10:05 a.m., the external traffic spike increased again. The engineer whispered, "The attack is escalating." The investors exchanged a look. Then the oldest among them spoke. "We don't have time for this." He turned directly toward Daniel. "If what Natalie said is even partially true, you've compromised the credibility of this entire company." Daniel said nothing. The investor's voice dropped. "You're stepping down." The words hit the room like thunder. Daniel blinked. "You can't do that." "We absolutely can," the investor replied. "This board invested $300 million into this company." Another red alert flashed behind them. "And right now, the only person who can stop this situation." He gestured toward the silent phone on the table. "Is the person you fired." The room waited. Daniel stood completely still. Then, slowly, he exhaled. At 10:08 a.m., Daniel Kessler spoke the words he never imagined he would say. "I resign as Chief Technology Officer of Argent Shield." No one applauded. No one spoke. The lead investor picked up the phone. "Call her back." The engineer dialed the number. 2 rings. Then, the call connected. "Natalie speaking." The investor spoke calmly. "This is Richard Hale from the board." There was a short pause. "Yes, Mr. Hale. Daniel Kessler has resigned." Across the operations center, Daniel stared at the floor. "We are formally requesting that you return to Argent Shield and restore system stability." Another pause. Then Natalie Cross spoke. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." 10 minutes later, at 10:21 a.m., Natalie Cross stepped through the glass entrance of Argent Shield. The same security guards who had escorted her out less than 2 hours earlier were now holding the doors open. No one spoke. Inside the lobby, employees were gathered in small groups. Whispers filled the building. Word had already spread. The architect had returned. At 10:23 a.m., Natalie Cross walked into the operations center. Every engineer stepped aside. The lead engineer moved quickly toward her. "We've stabilized traffic temporarily, but the containment protocol is still escalating." Natalie nodded. "I expected that." She placed her bag beside the main console. At 10:24 a.m., she began typing commands into the central control interface. Her hands moved quickly. Precisi. Confident. The monitoring wall flickered. Several red nodes turned amber. One engineer whispered, "She's rerouting traffic through the backup isolation layers." Another engineer leaned closer. "She's rebuilding authentication tokens." At 10:27 a.m., the first server cluster returned to green. A small wave of relief moved through the room. Natalie continued working without looking up. "Redirect external traffic to the secondary firewall," she said calmly. "Disable compromised routing nodes." The engineers moved instantly. 3 more clusters recovered. At 10:31 a.m., the attack traffic finally began to decline. The containment system slowed its escalation. One by one, the red warnings disappeared. At 10:34 a.m., the final alert vanished from the monitoring wall. The entire network returned to stable status. The operations center erupted into quiet applause. Not loud, not dramatic, but genuine. Natalie stepped back from the console. The lead investor approached her. "You just saved this company." She shook her head slightly. "No." She glanced briefly toward the empty space where Daniel had stood earlier. "I just let the system do what it was designed to do." The investor studied her. "And what was that?" Natalie picked up her bag. "Protect the company." Then she paused. and expose anyone who tried to compromise it. Lessons learned. Competence is quiet, but irreplaceable. Real experts rarely demand attention, but the moment they disappear, the entire system feels the absence. Integrity in security is everything. The moment someone manipulates the truth inside a security system, the system itself becomes the first victim. Never sacrifice your most valuable people for political convenience. Short-term reputation management can destroy long-term stability. True leadership protects truth, not ego. A leader who hides mistakes will eventually create disasters bigger than the mistake itself. Systems remember what people try to erase. Logs can be rewritten, but reality always leaves traces somewhere. The architect always understands the system better than the manager. Titles may control meetings, but knowledge controls outcomes. Calm intelligence defeats loud authority. The person who stays calm in chaos usually understands the situation better than everyone else in the room. Justice in the workplace doesn't always arrive immediately, but it often arrives precisely